The morning light filtered through half-drawn blinds as Andre's alarm buzzed for the third time. He reached over and silenced it, blinking away the remnants of sleep. It was Tuesday, just another workday. Nothing special about it, nothing to suggest it would become the day that changed everything. Andre stretched and swung his feet to the floor, the wooden boards cool beneath his toes. The apartment was quiet except for the distant hum of early morning traffic and the occasional bird chirping outside his window. He'd been in this one-bedroom place for almost 4 years now. It wasn't fancy, but it was his and he'd made it home. In the bathroom, he splashed cold water on his face and studied his reflection. 32 years old, with eyes that looked older sometimes. The slight gray at his temples had started appearing last year. His mother said it made him look distinguished. Andre just thought it made him look tired. "All right, let's get moving," he muttered to himself, a habit he'd picked up living alone. The kitchen was small but functional. Andre switched on the coffee maker he'd prepared the night before, one of his small but significant routines that made mornings bearable. While it brewed, he checked his phone. 2 text messages waited, one from his younger brother about weekend plans, and another from his supervisor confirming today's job site address. The coffee machine gurgled its final sounds as Andre replied to both messages. He poured the dark liquid into his favorite mug, a chipped blue one with the logo of his first employer. 7 years as an electrician now, and he still kept that mug around as a reminder of how far he'd come. Breakfast was simple, a banana and a protein bar he ate while reviewing the day's work order. A new construction in Highland Ridge, a neighborhood on the other side of town. Good money, but a longer commute. He'd need to get moving. Andre dressed methodically, work boots, dark blue jeans that could handle a day of kneeling and climbing, and a gray company polo with Reliable Electric embroidered on the chest. He clipped his ID badge to his belt and double-checked that his certification cards were in his wallet. In this line of work, you never knew when you'd need to prove you belonged somewhere. The tool belt went into his work truck, along with the specialized equipment for today's job. His truck was 6 years old with over 100,000 miles on it, but Andre kept it immaculate. The truck was both his office and his livelihood. Going to be a hot one today, the weather app on his phone warned. Andre grabbed an extra water bottle from the fridge before heading out. The morning air still held a hint of coolness as he locked his apartment door. Mrs. Chen from next door was watering her potted plants in the hallway. "Early day again?" she asked with a smile. "Always is," Andre replied. "Those houses don't wire themselves." "You work too hard," she said. The same thing she told him at least once a week. "Trying to save up for my own place," he reminded her. The dream that kept him taking extra shifts and weekend jobs. The drive to his favorite coffee shop took exactly 7 minutes in the early morning traffic. The small corner establishment was a daily ritual, his one small luxury in an otherwise practical life. The bell above the door jingled as he walked in. "Well, look who it is," called Ray from behind the counter. The older man had opened this place after retiring from the postal service and somehow remembered every regular's order. "Morning, Ray," Andre greeted him. "The usual, please." "Large, dark roast, splash of cream, no sugar," Ray recited, already reaching for a cup. "And how about one of those blueberry muffins? Just baked them." Andre hesitated, mentally calculating his food budget for the week. "Go on," Ray insisted. "You're too skinny anyway." "Fine, you win," Andre laughed. "But only because your muffins are worth breaking my budget for." As Ray bagged the muffin, he asked, "Big job today?" "New construction over in Highland Ridge," Andre explained, taking his coffee. "Whole house needs wiring," Ray whistled. "Fancy neighborhood. Those houses going for what, $500,000? More like 700 these days," Andre said, shaking his head. "And people are buying them up like hotcakes." "World's gone crazy," Ray commented, handing over the change. "You be careful over there. Those neighborhoods can be funny about who they think belongs and who doesn't." Andre nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. "Always am." Back in his truck, Andre plugged the address into his GPS. The job site was a 25-minute drive across town, through increasingly upscale neighborhoods. He'd worked in places like Highland Ridge, before new developments with massive homes and manicured landscapes where the construction workers were often the only people of color around. The radio played softly as he drove, a mix of news and music. A story about local police implementing community outreach programs caught his attention briefly. The reporter spoke about building trust between officers and neighborhoods. Andre turned it up slightly, listening to the police chief talk about progress and accountability. It sounded good on paper, at least. The neighborhoods gradually changed as he drove. Apartment buildings gave way to older single-family homes, which then transformed into newer, larger houses with 2- and 3-car garages. Highland Ridge was one of the newest developments, with some streets still showing vacant lots between partially completed homes. Andre pulled up to the address on his work order. It was a large 2-story house, framed but not yet finished, with plastic sheeting covering some of the window openings. Several contractor vehicles were already parked nearby. He recognized the plumber's van from previous jobs. Before getting out, Andre texted his supervisor. Arrived at site. Starting on the main floor wiring today. The response came back quickly. Plans are in the shared folder. Call if you have any questions. Team meeting tomorrow morning to go over progress. Andre gathered his tool belt and equipment bag, locking his truck before walking toward the house. The air smelled of fresh lumber and the distinctive scent of new construction. He loved that smell, the promise of something being built taking shape under skilled hands. Morning, called out a voice as Andre approached the front entrance. It was Lee, one of the carpenters he'd worked with on previous projects. Hey, how's it going? Andre replied, stopping to chat briefly. Slow and steady. Trying to get these interior walls finished today? Lee gestured toward the house. You doing the whole electrical? Yeah, starting with the main floor and working my way up. Should take most of the week, Lee nodded. Well, if you need anything moved to get to your stuff, just holler. Inside the house was a hive of activity. 2 painters were prepping walls in what would eventually be the living room. Someone was measuring for cabinets in the kitchen area. Andre found a relatively quiet corner to set up his equipment and review the electrical plans on his tablet. The design called for recessed lighting throughout the main floor. With smart home features integrated into the electrical system, it was the kind of detailed work Andre excelled at. He began by marking outlet positions and light fixture locations, working methodically through the rooms. Time slipped away as he focused on the task. By mid-morning, he had established his rhythm, drilling holes for wiring and installing outlet boxes. The work was physical but also required precision and planning. Each decision had to account for both the building code and the homeowner's desires. Around 11, Andre took a short break, stepping outside to stretch his back and drink some water. The neighborhood was quiet on a weekday morning. A few houses down, a landscaping crew worked on another property. Across the street, an older woman walked a small dog, giving the construction site a wide berth. Andre noticed a car drive by slowly, a silver sedan with 2 people inside. It continued down the street, then turned around at the cul-de-sac and drove past again, even slower this time. Something about their attention made him uneasy, but he brushed it off. Construction sites often attracted curious onlookers. Back inside, he returned to running wires through the kitchen wall, consulting his tablet occasionally to check specifications. The house would have all the modern conveniences: programmable lighting, built-in speakers, automated security. The kind of home he aspired to own himself someday. How's the wiring coming along? It was the site supervisor stopping by to check progress. On schedule, Andre replied, showing him the completed sections on the blueprint. Should have the main floor rough-in done by tomorrow afternoon. Perfect. The inspector's scheduled for Friday, so we need to stay on track. The supervisor moved on to check other aspects of the construction, leaving Andre to his work. The rhythm returned. Measure, drill, thread wiring, secure connections. The focused work was almost meditative, allowing his mind to wander occasionally to weekend plans or the small house he hoped to buy in a year or 2. If he kept saving carefully, he didn't notice the silver car had returned and parked across the street. Didn't see the 2 officers watching the construction site with unwarranted suspicion. Didn't know that someone had called in a report about a suspicious person who didn't look like they belonged in Highland Ridge. Andre was simply doing his job, unaware that in less than an hour, everything would change. Andre was deep in concentration, carefully threading electrical wiring through the kitchen wall when he heard heavy footsteps behind him. Assuming it was the site supervisor returning to check on his progress, he didn't immediately turn around. "Excuse me?" a stern voice called out. "What are you doing in here?" Andre turned to find 2 police officers standing just inside the doorway of the unfinished house. One was tall with a crew cut, maybe in his 40s, while the other was younger, probably still in his 20s, with an expression that seemed fixed somewhere between nervousness and aggression. "I'm working," Andre replied calmly, gesturing to his tool belt and the electrical wiring in his hands. "I'm the electrician for this build." The older officer stepped forward, hand resting casually on his belt near his holster. "We got a call about someone suspicious on the property. You have ID?" Andre felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach, the same one that appeared whenever he was questioned about belonging somewhere. He'd been through this before, at upscale stores, in nice neighborhoods, even once at a client's office where he'd been called to fix the lighting. "Yes, sir, I have ID," he said, keeping his voice level. "And I have work orders and credentials. I'm supposed to be here." He reached slowly toward his pocket, making sure his movements were deliberate and visible. Years of experiences had taught him the rules for moments like this. No sudden movements, keep your hands where they can see them. Speak clearly and respectfully no matter how unfair the situation. "My company ID is right here on my belt," Andre explained, pointing to the badge clipped to his waist. "And I have my electrician's license in my wallet." The younger officer moved to block the doorway while the older one took Andre's ID badge, examining it with exaggerated scrutiny. "Reliable Electric," the officer read aloud. "And you're here to do what exactly?" "I'm installing the electrical systems for the whole house," Andre explained patiently. "I've been here since 8 this morning. The site supervisor and several other contractors can verify that." The officer handed back the ID badge with obvious reluctance. "Where are these other contractors now?" Andre looked around, suddenly realizing the house had gone quiet. The painters and carpenters who had been working in nearby rooms seemed to have disappeared. Through the window he could see a few workers gathered by their trucks watching the scene unfold from a distance. "They were here earlier," Andre said, feeling a growing uneasiness. The supervisor might be in another part of the house or checking on one of the other builds down the street. The younger officer spoke up for the first time. "How long have you worked for this company?" 7 years, Andre replied. "Look, I can call my supervisor right now and he'll confirm everything." He reached for his phone in his pocket, but the older officer's hand shot out. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he ordered sharply. Andre froze, the knot in his stomach tightening into something closer to fear. "I'm just getting my phone to call my boss," he explained, his voice still calm but his heart beginning to race. "I said keep your hands visible," the officer repeated, his tone hardening. "How do we know you're really working here?" "This is an expensive neighborhood. We get people trying to steal from construction sites all the time." Andre took a deep breath, fighting to stay composed. "I understand your concerns, officers, but I'm just doing my job. I have all the proper documentation and work orders on my phone. If you'll allow me to show you—" "What's in the bag?" the younger officer interrupted, pointing to Andre's tool bag on the floor. "Just my equipment. Electrical tools, wiring, outlet boxes," Andre explained. "Standard electrician gear." The older officer stepped closer, looking around at the half-finished kitchen where Andre had been working. "You say you're wiring this place? Seems convenient. Perfect cover for someone casing the joint. Figuring out where to put in security systems." The accusation hung in the air, so absurd that Andre almost laughed. But the serious expressions on the officers' faces stopped him. They weren't joking. "Officers, I'm a licensed electrician with a legitimate job to do here. I'm not casing anything," Andre said, struggling to keep frustration from creeping into his voice. "If you want to wait while I call my supervisor, he'll clear this up in 2 minutes." Outside, more people had gathered. The landscapers from down the street had stopped working and were watching. An older couple walking their dog had paused across the street. Andre could feel the weight of all those eyes witnessing his humiliation. "Turn around and put your hands on the wall," the older officer instructed suddenly. "What? Why?" Andre asked, genuine shock breaking through his careful composure. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Turn around and put your hands on the wall," the officer repeated, louder this time. "That's an order." Andre's mind raced, calculating his options and finding none that seemed safe. Comply with an unjust demand or resist and risk escalation? It was a choice no one should have to make, yet here he was, making it in real time with his heart hammering against his ribs. "Officer, please." Andre tried one more time, his voice strained but still respectful. "Check my credentials. Call the construction company." "There's a misunderstanding here." The younger officer moved forward now, hand on his holster. "Last warning. Hands on the wall." With deliberate slowness, Andre turned and placed his palms against the unfinished drywall. The rough texture scratched against his skin as the older officer began patting him down. "Is this really necessary?" Andre asked, staring at the blank wall in front of him. "Be quiet," the older officer snapped, continuing the search. He pulled Andre's wallet from his back pocket and began going through it. "My electrician's license is in there," Andre said, "along with my driver's license and contractor credentials." The officer ignored him, emptying the contents of the wallet onto a nearby sawhorse. Credit cards, driver's license, electrician's certification, and a folded work order all scattered across the wooden surface. Through the window, Andre could see his coworker Lee had returned and was watching with visible distress. Lee took a step toward the house, but another worker grabbed his arm, holding him back. Everyone knew that intervening could make things worse. The younger officer picked up Andre's phone from the tool bag and began scrolling through it. "You don't have permission to go through my phone," Andre objected, his composure finally cracking. "I've cooperated with everything you've asked, but this isn't right. You need a warrant for that." "Sounds like resisting to me," the older officer said, exchanging a look with his partner. "Maybe obstruction too." "I'm not resisting anything," Andre insisted, his voice rising despite his best efforts to stay calm. "I'm telling you I have a right to privacy, and you have no cause to search me or my belongings. I'm here doing a job I was hired to do." The older officer grabbed Andre's arm and pulled it behind his back. "That's enough. You're coming with us until we sort this out." The cold metal of handcuffs bit into Andre's wrists before he could process what was happening. The reality of the situation crashed over him like a wave. He was being arrested for doing his job, for being in a place where someone decided he didn't belong. "This is a mistake," Andre said, his voice now shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "I haven't broken any laws." The officers began leading him toward the door, one on each side. Andre's tool belt was still on, digging uncomfortably into his waist as they moved. His half-finished work lay exposed, wires dangling from the walls. Outside, the small crowd of onlookers had grown. Neighbors had come out of nearby houses. Workers from adjacent construction sites stood watching. Andre felt their stares like physical touches as he was marched to the police car parked across the street. "Andre, what's happening?" Lee called out, finally breaking away from the others and approaching despite warnings from co-workers. "Stay back, sir," the younger officer ordered. "He works here," Lee insisted, holding up his hands to show he meant no trouble. "He's our electrician. This is a mistake." "We're just taking him in for questioning," the older officer replied dismissively. "If everything checks out, he'll be released." Andre caught Lee's eye as they passed. "Call Jackson," he said, referring to their supervisor. "Tell him what's happening." The younger officer opened the back door of the police car. "Watch your head," he said, the first almost kind word since this nightmare began. As Andre was guided into the back seat, he could see more people with phones out, recording the scene. Maybe that was good, evidence of what was happening. Or maybe it was just one more humiliation. His worst day becoming content for strangers to share and discuss. The car door slammed shut, sealing Andre in the back seat. Through the window, he could see Lee on his phone, presumably calling their supervisor. The landscapers had gathered in a tight group, talking animatedly and pointing. The older couple with the dog hurried away, as if the scene was too uncomfortable to witness. The older officer got into the driver's seat while his partner slid into the passenger side. They didn't speak to Andre as they started the car and pulled away from the curb. Andre stared out the window as the half-built house receded from view. His tools, his phone, and his dignity had all been left behind. The handcuffs dug into his wrists with every small movement of the car, a constant reminder of his powerlessness in this moment. "Where are you taking me?" he finally asked. "Downtown," the older officer replied without turning around. "For questioning." "Questioning about what?" "I told you everything already," neither officer answered. The radio crackled with dispatcher codes and fragments of other officers' communications. Normal day for them, Andre thought bitterly. Life-altering for him. The streets of Highland Ridge gave way to main roads, carrying him further from his interrupted workday and toward an uncertain confrontation. In the silence of the police car, one thought kept circling in Andre's mind. This wasn't about what he'd done. This was about who they thought he was. The police station smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. Andre sat on a hard metal chair in a small room with beige walls and a single window too high to see through. His wrists were raw where the handcuffs had been, though they'd removed them after bringing him into this room. A clock on the wall read 2:17 p.m. He'd been here for nearly 2 hours already. The door opened, and the older officer from the construction site walked in, now carrying a manila folder. A different officer followed him in, a woman with short graying hair and lieutenant bars on her uniform. "I'm Lieutenant Rivera," she said, pulling out a chair across from Andre. "Officer Daniels here has filled me in on the situation at Highland Ridge." Andre sat up straighter. "Lieutenant, there's been a mistake. I'm an electrician. I was working at that site legally. I have credentials and work orders to prove it." The lieutenant glanced at Officer Daniels, who avoided eye contact. "We're aware of that now," she said carefully. "Your supervisor called. He was quite vocal about the situation." Relief washed over Andre, followed immediately by a surge of anger. "Then why am I still here? Why was I brought in at all?" Officer Daniels shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. The lieutenant opened the folder in front of her. According to the report, there was a call about suspicious activity at the construction site. Officers responded and found you there. You allegedly became confrontational when questioned. "Confrontational?" Andre repeated, disbelief evident in his voice. "I showed them my ID. I explained I was working. I asked to call my supervisor to verify. How is that confrontational?" Lieutenant Rivera made a note on the paper in front of her. "The report also mentions you refused to comply with orders." Andre leaned forward, struggling to keep his voice level. "I complied with everything they asked. The only thing I objected to was them searching my phone without a warrant, which is my right." The lieutenant looked at Officer Daniels again, who finally spoke. He reached for something in his pocket without permission. "Could have been a weapon." "It was my phone," Andre said, his patience wearing thin. "I told you it was my phone before I reached for it. I was trying to call my supervisor." The room fell silent for a moment. The lieutenant closed the folder and sighed. "Mr. Lewis, I understand this has been difficult, but you have to understand. Officers have to make quick judgments in the field." "Based on what?" Andre asked, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. Neither officer answered immediately. The silence stretched, becoming its own kind of answer. "Am I being charged with anything?" Andre finally asked. The lieutenant hesitated before responding. "You were brought in for questioning regarding potential trespassing and resisting an officer's commands." "Trespassing at my own job site?" "Where I had every right to be. As I said, your supervisor has verified your employment and presence at the site was legitimate." "Then I should be free to go," Andre stated, standing up. "Unless there's some other reason you're holding me here." The lieutenant nodded slowly. "You're not under arrest." "But there's paperwork to process before—" The door opened again and a man in a crisp suit stepped in. He was middle-aged, with salt and pepper hair and glasses, carrying a leather briefcase. "I'm Richard Wilson, attorney for Reliable Electric," he announced. "I'm here to accompany Mr. Lewis. Has he been charged with anything?" The atmosphere in the room changed immediately. The lieutenant stood up. "Mr. Wilson, we were just explaining to Mr. Lewis that he's free to go once we process the release paperwork." "That won't be necessary," the attorney said firmly. "My client has been detained without cause for over 2 hours. Either charge him with a specific offense right now or we're walking out that door." Officer Daniels stepped forward. "Now wait a minute." "No, you wait," Wilson interrupted. "I've already reviewed the body camera footage that Officer Pearson, your partner, I believe, uploaded to your system. It clearly shows my client acting professionally and cooperatively while being subjected to unlawful search and detainment." Andre looked up in surprise. He hadn't realized the younger officer's camera had been recording, or that the footage would already be in the system. The lieutenant's expression tightened. "You've accessed police body camera footage? How exactly did you manage that?" "Your chief of police granted access when I explained the situation," Wilson replied smoothly. He seemed quite concerned about potential liability issues. "Now, is my client free to go or do I need to make some calls?" The room fell silent again, tension crackling in the air. Finally, the lieutenant nodded. "Mr. Lewis is free to go. Officer Daniels will escort you out and return your belongings." Wilson turned to Andre. "Get your things. I'll wait for you in the lobby." Officer Daniels led Andre down a hallway to a processing desk, where a bored-looking clerk retrieved a plastic bin containing his wallet, phone, keys, and work ID. Andre signed a form acknowledging receipt of his belongings. "Your tool belt and equipment are still at the construction site," Officer Daniel said stiffly. "We didn't have cause to confiscate those." Andre pocketed his belongings without responding. What could he possibly say to this man who had upended his day, humiliated him in front of co-workers and strangers, and was now acting as if it was all just routine procedure? In the lobby, Wilson was waiting with another man, Jackson, Andre's supervisor. Jackson rushed forward when he saw Andre. "Man, are you okay? This is complete bullshit." "I can't believe they did this," Andre nodded, still processing everything that had happened. "I'm all right, just shaken up." Jackson turned to glare at Officer Daniels, who had followed Andre to the lobby. "You guys should be ashamed. He's the best electrician I've got, and you treat him like a criminal because what? He doesn't look like he belongs in Highland Ridge?" "Jackson," Wilson cautioned quietly. "Let's get Andre out of here first." Outside, the afternoon sun felt shockingly bright after hours in the fluorescent-lit station. Andre took a deep breath of fresh air, trying to ground himself. "My truck is still at the job site," he realized. "I'll drive you," Jackson offered immediately. "Unless you want to go home. Nobody would blame you for taking the rest of the day." Andre considered it for a moment, then shook his head. "No, I want to finish what I started." Wilson looked at him with concern. "Are you sure that's wise? After what happened, I'm not going to let them stop me from doing my job," Andre said firmly. "That's what this was really about, right? Someone decided I didn't belong there. I'm going to prove them wrong." The drive back to Highland Ridge was mostly silent. Wilson made a few calls from the back seat. Speaking in careful legal terms about potential civil rights, violations, and unlawful detention, Jackson gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "The company's behind you 100%, Jackson said eventually. "Whatever you want to do about this, we've got your back." Andre nodded, watching the neighborhoods change as they drove. The same progression he'd noticed that morning. Apartment buildings to modest homes to increasingly large houses now seemed like a map of invisible boundaries he wasn't supposed to cross. "I just want to finish the job," he said quietly. "Today, at least. I need to think about the rest." When they pulled up to the construction site, several workers rushed over. Lee was the first to reach them. "Andre, man, we were worried sick. You okay?" "I'm all right," Andre assured him, touched by the genuine concern. "We told those cops you belonged here," another worker added. "They wouldn't listen." Andre nodded, not trusting himself to respond without emotion. The solidarity meant something, but it couldn't erase what had happened. His tool belt was still where he'd left it, wires still dangling from the wall he'd been working on when the officers arrived. It felt like days had passed, not hours. Andre picked up the belt, its familiar weight somehow comforting. "You sure you want to jump back in?" Jackson asked. "Nobody would blame you if—" "I'm sure," Andre interrupted, buckling the belt around his waist. "I've got wiring to finish." Wilson approached, putting away his phone. "I need to get back to the office, but we'll talk tomorrow about next steps. The company wants to file a formal complaint, but ultimately it's your decision how to proceed." Andre nodded. "Thank you for coming to get me out." "That's what the company keeps lawyers for," Wilson replied with a slight smile. "To protect our people." As Wilson left, Jackson hesitated. "I'll be checking the other sites this afternoon. Call me if you need anything at all." "I will," Andre promised. Alone finally, Andre stood in the half-finished kitchen, taking in the space that had been transformed in his mind from a simple work site to something else entirely. The walls that had been just infrastructure that morning now seemed to hold the echo of what had happened. He picked up his wire strippers and turned back to the exposed wiring. "Focus on what you can control," he told himself, one connection at a time. Outside, he could hear the normal sounds of construction resuming, hammering, the whine of a saw, workers calling to each other. Life continuing as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and Andre knew he would never look at a police car the same way again. Never feel quite as secure in his right to be somewhere. Never take for granted the fragile permission that could be revoked at any moment. He made the next connection, then the next. Each small task completed was an act of resistance in its own way. They had taken his dignity, but they couldn't take his skill, his knowledge, or his determination to finish what he'd started. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the unfinished windows. Andre had completed the wiring he'd planned for the day. Tomorrow would bring decisions about complaints and possible legal action. But tonight, at least, he could go home knowing he hadn't let them win completely. He'd come back. He'd done his job, and tomorrow, despite everything, he would do it again. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Andre tossed and turned, his mind replaying the day's events on an endless loop. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the officers' faces, felt the cold metal of handcuffs against his skin, heard the whispers of onlookers as he was led away from his workplace in humiliation. Around 3 a.m, he gave up trying. Sitting at his kitchen table with a mug of tea, Andre scrolled through his phone. There were dozens of messages, co-workers checking on him, friends who'd somehow already heard what happened, his brother asking if he needed anything. The company had given him the next day off, but Andre wasn't sure if staying home alone with his thoughts would be any better than working. A new message appeared from Lee. "It's all over social media. Someone posted video." Andre's stomach tightened as he clicked the link. The shaky cell phone footage showed him being led to the police car in handcuffs, the officers flanking him on either side. The person filming had captured Lee shouting that Andre worked there, and Officer Daniel's dismissive response. In just 8 hours, the video had thousands of views and hundreds of comments. Most expressed outrage on his behalf, but some defended the police, claiming they were just doing their job, or suggesting there must be more to the story. A few comments were openly racist, making Andre close the app in disgust. His private humiliation had become public spectacle, dissected by strangers who knew nothing about him. As dawn broke, Andre showered and dressed, deciding he couldn't just sit at home all day. He needed to talk to someone who would understand, someone who had been through something similar. His uncle Calvin had been a construction worker for 30 years before retiring. If anyone would understand the complicated feelings swirling inside Andre, it would be him. Andre grabbed his keys and headed to his uncle's house across town. Calvin was already up, tending to his vegetable garden when Andre pulled into the driveway. At 65, he still moved with the strength and purpose of a much younger man, though his hair had gone completely white and his face showed the lines of a life spent working outdoors. "Wasn't expecting to see you today," Calvin said, straightening up from the tomato plants he'd been inspecting. One look at Andre's face told him something was wrong. "Come on inside. I'll put on some coffee." In Calvin's small but immaculate kitchen, Andre told him everything. The call to police, the accusations, the handcuffs, the holding cell, the company lawyer, and now the viral video. Calvin listened without interrupting, his weathered face giving away little except a tightening around the eyes when Andre described being led away in front of everyone. "Nothing new under the sun," Calvin said finally when Andre had finished. "Same thing happened to me in '89, working on that office building downtown. Difference is, nobody had cell phones back then. No videos, no lawyers showing up to get me out. Spent the night in jail before my foreman could straighten things out." Andre stared into his coffee mug. "So what am I supposed to do? Just accept that this is how it is?" Calvin shook his head. "Didn't say that. Times are different now. You got options I didn't have." "The company wants to file a complaint," Andre said. "Wilson, their lawyer, says we have a strong case for civil rights violations." "And what do you want?" Calvin asked, studying his nephew's face. Andre hesitated. "I don't know. Part of me just wants to forget it ever happened. Go back to work.
Keep my head down."
But another part wants justice," Calvin finished for him. "Wants those officers to face consequences for what they did." "Yeah," Andre admitted. "But is it worth it? The time, the stress, putting myself out there even more? What if nothing comes of it anyway?" Calvin was quiet for a long moment, looking out his kitchen window at the garden he'd spent years cultivating. "When I was about your age, something like this happened to my friend Raymond. Good carpenter. Worked with him on a dozen jobs. Some security guard accused him of stealing tools. By the time it got sorted out, Ray had lost the job. He was so angry, so hurt. Wanted to file complaints, get a lawyer, the whole 9 yards. Did he?" Calvin shook his head. "No. His wife was pregnant with their first child. He was worried about making waves, getting a reputation as a troublemaker. So he let it go." Calvin turned back to Andre. 2 months later, same thing happened to another brother on another site. Then another. Pattern keeps repeating because nobody breaks it. The weight of his uncle's words sank in. "So you think I should fight it?" I think you should do what feels right to you, Calvin said. But remember, you got something Ray didn't have back then. Evidence. That body camera footage, that cell phone video, and you got a company backing you up. Those are powerful tools. Andre nodded slowly, considering. I'm worried about what happens at work. What if this follows me? What if clients don't want me on their properties because they've seen the video? That's a real concern, Calvin acknowledged. But hiding won't make it go away. Video's already out there. Question is, do you want to let other people control the narrative, or do you want to have a say in how your story gets told? They talked for another hour, Calvin sharing stories of his own experiences, both the times he'd stood up and the times he'd walked away. By the time Andre left, the sun was high in the sky, and his mind felt clearer than it had since the moment the officers had first approached him. Back at his apartment, Andre called Wilson, the company lawyer. I want to file the complaint, he said, and I want to tell my side of what happened. No more hiding. The next day, Andre returned to work. He'd half expected whispers and stares, but instead found solidarity. Lee had organized the other workers to greet him with coffee and donuts. The site supervisor had implemented a new policy requiring all workers to wear company ID badges prominently. Even the owners of neighboring houses under construction came by to express their support. The woman who lives in the blue house down the street brought this for you, Lee said, handing Andre an envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. I witnessed what happened to you. I've already contacted the police department with my statement. This should never have happened, and I'm sorry it did. Dr. Thompson, 1842 Highland Ridge. The support was overwhelming, but it didn't erase the reality of what had happened or the difficult path ahead. That evening, Andre met with Wilson and a civil rights attorney named Powell at the company offices. They reviewed the body camera footage together, which was even worse than Andre had remembered. The officers' bias was evident from the start, their assumptions clear in every question they asked. The department has already reached out about settling this quietly, Wilson explained. They know they're in the wrong here. I don't want to settle quietly, Andre said firmly. I want accountability. I want changes to how they train their officers. I want a public apology. Powell nodded approvingly. It won't be easy. These cases rarely are. But you have compelling evidence, credible witnesses, and a clear case of racial profiling and unlawful detention. What about the officers? Andre asked. Will they face any consequences? That's largely up to the department's internal affairs division, Powell explained. But public pressure can make a difference. Which brings us to the media. Several news outlets have reached out wanting to interview you, Wilson added. It's completely your choice whether to speak with them. The company will support whatever you decide. Andre thought about his uncle's words. Control the narrative. Tell your own story. I'll do it, he said. But I want to be clear that this isn't just about me. It's about a pattern that needs to change. 2 days later, Andre sat in a studio across from a reporter, bright lights making him sweat slightly. The camera's red light blinked on and the reporter began. We're here today with Andre Lewis, an electrician whose wrongful arrest at a construction site has sparked outrage after body camera footage revealed clear bias by responding officers. Mr. Lewis, can you tell us what happened that day? Andre took a deep breath and began to tell his story. Not just the details of that day, but the larger context of his life. How he'd worked hard to build his career. How he'd faced subtle and not so subtle discrimination before. How this incident was not isolated, but part of a pattern experienced by too many others. As he spoke, he thought about his uncle Calvin and his friend Raymond from all those years ago. He thought about the next generation of young black tradespeople who would enter these fields. He thought about the officers who had arrested him, wondering if they were watching, if his words could somehow reach them. The interview lasted 20 minutes, but its impact would stretch much further. By that evening, it had been picked up by national news outlets. By the next morning, the police chief had announced an internal investigation and review of training procedures. By the end of the week, community organizations had organized a public forum on policing and racial bias, inviting Andre to speak. It wasn't justice, not yet, but it was movement. It was the beginning of accountability. It was the sound of a pattern being disrupted. When Andre returned to the Highland Ridge job site the following Monday, something had shifted. The neighbors waved instead of staring suspiciously. Several other construction companies had implemented new ID badge policies similar to Reliable Electric's. And most significantly, the police department had issued a formal apology, with both officers placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. "You've started something," Lee told him during their lunch break. "People are talking about this everywhere." Andre nodded, feeling both the weight and the importance of what lay ahead. The complaint process would be long. The media attention would eventually fade. Real change would require sustained pressure and engagement. But for the first time since those officers had approached him, Andre felt something beyond anger or fear or resignation. He felt hope, not just for justice in his own case, but for the possibility that his story might help break a cycle that had gone on far too long. "One day at a time," he said, picking up his tools to return to work. One connection at a time. 3 months passed. The Highland Ridge house was nearly complete, its electrical systems installed and inspected, all by Andre's hands. Despite suggestions that he might want to transfer to a different site after what happened, he had insisted on finishing what he started. Each day he worked there felt like reclaiming a piece of dignity that had been taken from him. Today, though, he wasn't working. Today, he sat in the back of a crowded city council chamber, hands clasped tightly in his lap, listening as voices rose and fell around him. On the agenda, police reform and community oversight. "The data speaks for itself," a woman at the podium was saying, gesturing to a projection screen showing arrest statistics broken down by neighborhood and race. Black and brown residents are stopped, questioned, and detained at rates far exceeding their population percentages. What happened to Mr. Lewis was not an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern that this council can no longer ignore. Andre felt a light touch on his arm. His uncle Calvin had come with him for moral support, along with Wilson, the company lawyer who had become something of a friend during these past months of legal proceedings. "You ready?" Calvin whispered. Andre nodded, though his heart was pounding. Public speaking had never been his thing. Before all this, he'd been content working with his hands, solving practical problems, staying out of the spotlight. Now strangers recognized him in grocery stores. Now his name appeared in newspaper headlines. Now his story was being used as evidence in policy debates like this one. "Next, we'll hear from Andre Lewis," the council chair announced. Andre walked to the podium, adjusting the microphone to his height. The faces before him blurred slightly as his nervousness peaked, then settled as he focused on the prepared statement in his hands. "My name is Andre Lewis," he began, his voice steadier than he'd expected. 3 months ago, I was handcuffed and arrested while doing my job as an electrician. I broke no laws. I threatened no one. I was simply existing in a space where someone decided I didn't belong." As he continued, describing what had happened that day at Highland Ridge and in the months since, Andre felt a strange calmness overtake him. This was no longer just about his humiliation or his anger. It had become something larger, a chance to create meaningful change. "The officers who arrested me were eventually disciplined," he said, nearing the end of his statement. "One was suspended for 2 weeks without pay. The other received a formal reprimand. Both were required to undergo additional training." He paused, looking up from his paper to make eye contact with the council members. "Is that justice? Maybe, maybe not. But what matters more to me is that this never happens to anyone else. The proposed Community Oversight Board won't solve every problem overnight, but it's a start. It's accountability. It's a voice for people who too often go unheard. I urge you to vote yes." The applause was immediate and sustained as Andre returned to his seat. Calvin squeezed his shoulder, pride evident in his expression. In the weeks and months after the incident, his uncle had been a constant source of strength, helping Andre navigate the unfamiliar waters of activism and advocacy. After 2 more hours of testimonies and debate, the council voted 7-2 in favor of establishing the Oversight Board. The crowd erupted in cheers. For the first time that day, Andre felt himself smile. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was progress. Hard-fought, community-driven progress. Outside the chamber, as people dispersed into the early evening, a young man approached Andre. He looked to be in his early 20s, dressed in work clothes similar to what Andre wore on job sites. "Mr. Lewis, I just wanted to say thank you," the young man said, extending his hand. "I'm a plumber's apprentice. Been on the job 6 months. Last week, something similar happened to me at a site in Westlake. When the officers came up questioning me, I remembered your story. I knew what to say, what my rights were. It didn't escalate because I was prepared. Andre shook his hand, momentarily speechless. This was the first time a stranger had shared such a direct impact. "I'm glad it helped," he said finally. "No one should go through what I went through." "The thing is," the young man continued, "when it was happening, I wasn't just scared for myself. I was thinking, what if this ruins my chance at this career? What if word gets around that I'm difficult? But then I remembered how your company backed you up, and I thought, that's the kind of place I want to work. So I stood my ground. And you know what? My supervisor showed up and backed me completely." As the young man walked away, Calvin nudged Andre's arm. "See that right there? That's why all this matters." Later that evening, Andre sat with his brother Devin at a small restaurant downtown, celebrating the council vote. The place was busy, filled with the hum of conversations and clinking glasses. "So what's next for the famous Andre Lewis?" Devin asked, only half joking. "Running for office? Starting a foundation? You've got options now, bro." Andre shook his head, smiling. "None of the above. I'm still just an electrician." "An electrician who changed city policy," Devin pointed out. "An electrician who's got the police department implementing new training procedures. An electrician who's been on national news. All I did was tell the truth about what happened to me," Andre said, suddenly self-conscious. "The right people listened, that's all. You're too modest. You know how many people wouldn't have spoken up? Would have just taken the injustice and tried to move on? It takes courage to do what you did." Andre picked at his food, thinking about his uncle's friend Raymond from decades ago, who had chosen to stay silent, thinking about how many others had made the same choice out of necessity, out of self-preservation, out of the simple desire to live their lives without added complications. "I had advantages others don't," he acknowledged. "A company that stood behind me. Video evidence, media attention, good lawyers. Without all that, but that's part of the change too, isn't it?" Devin said. "Now more companies are learning they need to stand up for their workers. More people understand why video evidence matters. The ripple effects go on and on." As they finished dinner, Andre's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Powell, the civil rights attorney who had worked on his case. "Just heard from the department. New training program approved. They want you to review the materials, provide feedback. This is a big step." Andre showed the message to Devin, who raised his water glass in a toast. "To making a difference." "To making a difference," Andre echoed, though a part of him still felt strange accepting praise for something that had begun with his own pain and humiliation. The next morning, Andre was back at work, this time at a new construction site across town. The company had promoted him to lead electrician, with a small team reporting to him now. The job was challenging in the best ways, focusing his mind on practical problems and solutions. During their lunch break, he noticed one of his newer team members, a young woman named Tyler, scrolling through her phone with a troubled expression. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Not really," she replied, showing him a news story about another incident of racial profiling, this time involving a college student wrongfully detained on campus. "It just never stops, does it?" Andre considered her question seriously. "Not yet, but it gets harder for them to justify each time. More people are watching. More people are speaking up, like you did," she said. "Like many of us are doing," he corrected gently. As they packed up from lunch and prepared to return to work, Andre's phone rang. It was the producer from the news station that had first interviewed him, asking if he'd be willing to comment on the department's new training program. For a moment, Andre was tempted to decline. His life had finally started returning to normal. The spotlight had begun to fade. But then he thought of the young plumber's apprentice from yesterday, standing his ground because he'd heard Andre's story. He thought of Tyler's discouragement at seeing history seemingly repeat itself. He thought of his uncle Calvin, who had lived through decades of these injustices with far fewer tools to fight back. "Yes," he told the producer, "I'll comment. But I want to broaden the conversation. It's not just about training. It's about culture. It's about who gets the benefit of the doubt and who doesn't. It's about who feels protected by police and who feels threatened." After hanging up, Andre returned to his work, carefully connecting wires that would eventually bring light and power to the building. There was something deeply satisfying about this work, taking separate elements and creating connections between them, building systems that served a greater purpose. In many ways, It wasn't so different from what he'd been doing these past months in community meetings and council chambers, making connections, building systems, trying to create something that worked better than what had come before. The house at Highland Ridge had been completed last week. Andre had been there for the final inspection, watching as the new owners, a young family with 2 small children, toured their future home. They'd recognized him from the news stories and had seemed momentarily starstruck, then embarrassed by their reaction. "We're glad it's you who wired our home," the father had said eventually, "not just because you're clearly good at your job, but because we want our kids to grow up in a house built by people who stand up for what's right." It was the kind of comment that still made Andre uncomfortable, this notion that he'd done something extraordinary, when all he'd really done was refuse to accept an injustice. But it also reminded him that sometimes the most powerful thing an ordinary person could do was simply to tell their truth and insist that it mattered. 6 months after those officers had approached him on a routine workday, Andre's life had both changed completely and remained fundamentally the same. He still woke early, still fixed practical problems with his hands, still looked forward to someday buying his own home. But now he also sat in community meetings, reviewed police training materials, and occasionally gave interviews about his experience. It wasn't the life he'd planned. It wasn't a burden he'd asked to carry. But if his story helped create even the smallest crack in a system that had hurt so many for so long, then perhaps it was a purpose worth embracing. As the afternoon sun warmed the construction site, Andre guided his team through the day's tasks, connecting one wire at a time, building something that would last long after they were gone. Just as he hoped the changes he'd helped set in motion might outlast the memory of what had happened to him that day at Highland Ridge, a single injustice that, for once, had not gone unanswered.